Well, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be, friends. This is Casey Gwynn, the president of Alliance for Hope International, and it's December 20th, and we're honored to have those of you joining us that are working this week as we get closer and closer to Christmas and other holidays that people celebrate. So we're happy to have you with us today for our webinar with Dr. Cindy Cassady. You can see on the screen the information and the contact information. You can contact Sarah Sherman-Julian, who is overseeing this webinar today. If you need anything from us, you can also see that the webinar is being recorded today, and you can send in questions during the webinar. So we're live right now broadcasting from San Diego, but we have all of our participants muted. So if you would like to send in a question during the presentation, you are more than able to do that, and Sarah will pass those on to me and to Dr. Cassady after we finish her presentation today. So we want to thank you all for being with us and hope you all have a blessed holiday season. Our focus today is really talking about working with the deaf community and others with disabilities in the Family Justice Center context, and really talking about increasing inclusion and access to services. As I mentioned, my name is Casey Gwynn. I serve as the president of Alliance for Hope International. And I will tell you that in 1989, when I first proposed the concept of a family justice center in San Diego, I didn't get it about accessing services for people who have a very difficult time in the way our systems are set up. I didn't have any relationship or knowledge about the deaf community or the sight or hearing impaired communities in general. I didn't have a lot of understanding about marginalized communities. And so at the very beginning for me, because I had never as a prosecutor really dealt with those communities, the concept of the Family Justice Center didn't even include what we're going to be talking about today with Dr. Cassady. As we get started today, I do want to mention a few things. Some of you know that registration just opened for our International Family Justice Center Conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in April. We're very excited to be co-hosting our conference with the Wisconsin Child Abuse Symposium. So we will have 700 to 800 folks in Milwaukee the first week of April for both our Family Justice Center conference and dual track sessions with the Wisconsin Child Abuse Symposium. Many of you know that Alliance for Hope International is advocating for the co-location of child advocacy centers and family justice centers across the United States. And we are modeling that with our conference in April. And we will be profiling the largest family justice center now in the United States, which is called the Sojourner Truth Family Peace Center. It's located just outside downtown Milwaukee. It's a full city block of 72,000 square feet of services for victims of sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, elder abuse, and human trafficking. So we're going to be excited to see that center. We'll have a special event at the Harley-Davidson Museum. Milwaukee is the home of Harley-Davidson. I confess I'm a biker, so I particularly like going to Milwaukee. Riding motorcycles the first week of April in Milwaukee is not well advised, but nevertheless, we're going to have a great time there together. For those of you that are new to the Family Justice Center world, Gail Strack and I have written 11 books over the last 11 years. Those books span the gamut from working with teams to working in family justice centers to the impact of trauma on children. Our two seminal books on the Family Justice Center movement are on the screen there. One is called Dream Big, and the other is called Dream Big, Start Small. Dream Big is kind of the philosophical underpinnings of the movement toward co-locating services for victims under one roof in the Family Justice Center concept, and Dream Big, Start Small is a how-to manual. This last year, I wrote a new book called Cheering for the Children that is focused on the impact of adverse childhood experiences on children witnessing domestic violence, experiencing child abuse. That book is available at Amazon, or you can get it on our website. The Amazon site also includes a Kindle version or an electronic version for iPads and iPhones. And it's a book that really takes you through the impact of childhood trauma on adult illness, disease, and criminality connected to the ACE study. And then it takes you through the vision for our work with children exposed to domestic violence in Camp Hope America. And really, my journey through violence and abuse, having grown up in a family impacted by child abuse and domestic violence, and really some of the things that we have learned in working with trauma exposed children. We do have a mailing list and membership group. We have about 14,000 people that get regular access to our information and our programs and our institutes and conferences. All you have to do is pick up a cell phone and text the word Hope Giver, all one word, to 22828, and you will get a response, and then you can confirm your email address, and we will include you in our future mailings and announcements about webinars and conferences and events. We have a social media presence as well. That social media presence is represented in a series of websites. The umbrella website is allianceforhope.com. We don't yet have allianceforhope.org. We're working on it. But it turns out it's owned by a Chinese webmaster, and he currently has a Chinese restaurant menu at allianceforhope.org and wants to sell it to us for a very large amount of money. So we're at allianceforhope.com, and then you can see our other websites for the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, for the Family Justice Center World, and for Camp Hope America. We'd love to have you like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. We have a number of Twitter accounts as well. It's always great to have people keeping up with what we're doing, and for you to share as well on our Twitter pages what you're doing. We do want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for making this training possible. We have 3 major federal grants, 2 from the Office on Violence Against Women and 1 from the Office on Victims of Crime. The OVW grants focus on strangulation and on the development of family justice centers. This particular webinar focuses on working with deaf and sight-impaired victims in family justice centers, and we will be recording a second webinar with Dr. Cassady later this week that will be available on our website, drilling deeper into this whole topic of working with deaf and disabled victims of trauma, and in particular of strangulation assaults. We won't be broadcasting that webinar live, but it will be available along with this webinar on our website at familyjusticecenter.org or .com. We always like to give a shout out to the director of the Office on Violence Against Women, Bea Hansen. Bea will likely be concluding her time at the conclusion of the Obama administration and leading OVW, but she has been a very faithful leader and advocate for our work and for the work of so many organizations across the country, with a real focus not only on homicide prevention, but on this whole issue of access for the LGBT community, access for marginalized populations. And we just really appreciate Bea's leadership. Kevin Sweeney is our program manager for both of our OVW grants, and Kevin has been involved supporting us for so many years in his work at OVW, and we very much appreciate his help. I also want to give a shout out to the Vera Institute. We do not specialize in services for people with disabilities and the deaf community in general, but the Vera Institute does. If you're not familiar with it, you can go to verainstitute.org. The Vera Institute is an OVW technical assistance provider and does provide assistance to all OVW grantees that are working with the deaf community. And so I wanted to thank them for their work and make them a resource to you if you're not aware of their work. As we get started, we always like to give a shout out to our team at Alliance for Hope International. Gail Strack, our CEO, is on a bit of a sabbatical for a couple months here, caring for her new grandson, while her daughter, who's an attorney here in San Diego, goes back to work. And then you can see Sarah Sherman-Julian down there at the bottom left, who is running our webinar today. Sarah is a program assistant with a number of our programs, but is specifically focusing right now on the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. But we appreciate her stepping in today to help lead this webinar. We also have an upcoming 4-day advanced strangulation prevention course in San Diego. Registration just opened for that course. We're already getting quite a few people registering and booking hotel rooms for that. We are romantics at heart, so we decided to start on Valentine's Day. I know that seems a little odd, but it just happened to work out that we were going to do a strangulation prevention course starting on Valentine's Day, because that is what was available with the hotel. So it's tough to get hotel rooms in San Diego. It's our high season. it's conference season, but we're very thankful to have a very nice hotel for that course. You can see the picture from our last course, which we held at One Safe Place, one of the largest family justice center campuses in America, in Fort Worth, Texas in October, and that was a great time together. We will be here in San Diego in February, though, and we are prioritizing multidisciplinary teams to come to our 4-day event. So please go to strangulationtraininginstitute.com or .org, and you can get more information about that. We're very honored today to have Dr. Cindy Cassady with us. Cindy is a consultant and lecturer at the University of Kibungo in Rwanda. She has done a lot of work in the community for many, many years, 30 plus years. She has a background in clinical psychology. She has done training at Alliant University. She has been in our world for probably at least 15 years, maybe even more than that. She has had both a private practice working with deaf adults and children who have been victims of gender-based violence and child abuse. She's done a lot of work locally in San Diego, nationally, and internationally. She has been, for the last couple years, providing clinical supervision and training to the clinical psychologists at the Isange One-Stop Center in Kachiru Police Hospital in Africa. And the Isange One-Stop Center, I'll have Sydney talk a little bit about, but it's probably the closest thing to a family justice center in Africa right now. And Cindy is obviously very much a believer in the collaborative services approach. You can see a little picture there that Cindy actually drew for Gail and for me. We always joke that I'm the dream big guy and Gail is the start small gal. And quite frankly, my big dreams would produce nothing if it wasn't for Gail and others that have actually been able to figure out how to implement some of my crazy dreams and hallucinations over the last 30 plus years. But we really appreciated that drawing, and we have it framed and on our wall here at Alliance for Hope International. So Cindy, welcome. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
You're here in the United States for a week or so for the holidays.
Yes, yes.
So you go back to Africa when?
Beginning of January.
Okay. Well, it's great to have you. So just tell us a little bit more about your journey, kind of your early work in San Diego. Let's talk about that first, and then your connection to the Family Justice Center world, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. I think I started with the Family Justice Center almost when the Family Justice Center started. And I started with clinical psychology, providing psychotherapy, and I saw that there was a piece missing, and the piece that was missing was the Family Justice Center serving the deaf community. And there are not many services typically offered for the deaf community to receive help with gender-based violence or intimate partner violence. So I saw this as a tremendous opportunity for San Diego to provide services in this area.
And I remember, I don't know if it was maybe 6 months or a year into the opening of the San Diego Family Justice Center, you hosted an event. I think it was an open house, or it might have been a bit of an orientation for deaf survivors that you were working with. And I remember that experience like it was yesterday. Gail had asked, I was the elected city attorney of San Diego at the time, and Gail had asked me to come over to the Family Justice Center and greet the group. And I remember walking in, and you introduced me, and 75 women started clapping, raising their hands and clapping for me. And I was so moved by that. I've never seen, in my life, I had never seen 75 deaf women in one place ever, let alone realizing that these were survivors of violence and abuse who are so often just invisible to the public, to the civil justice system, to the criminal justice system. And we were welcoming them into our community, and they brought their community to us. And I don't know if you remember that day, but that was very moving to me.
I think what was so important about that day was to actually make deaf people visible to the Family Justice Center system. Um, so I had been working in private practice in San Diego and then worked at Deaf Community Services. And I think we were all working in our own little silos. So the key critical component of that day was to actually make the Family Justice Center visible to the deaf community,
Mm.
but also to make deaf people visible to the Family Justice Center and to actually bring the two together.
Mm.
So yeah, it was a very exciting time.
Well, and I remember, Gail was the director of the Family Justice Center during that time, and she too was just very moved by the whole thing. And it really began a journey for us of better understanding the needs of marginalized communities and often invisible communities, and the difficulties of accessing services in our systems. When we think, oh, it's really simple, you just get a TTY line and you do a few things and then you're all set. You don't have to worry about anything else. And the complexity of that was just such an education for us. So talk just a little bit for me too, before you dive into your PowerPoint, about your work now in Africa and what you're doing there, what took you there and what you're doing there.
Uh, well, what took me there was after many years, after my PhD in clinical psychology, I went back and I did a master's in peace and conflict resolution and international human rights, and decided that I needed to be in Africa. I needed to be in another country, serving a different community. And so I ended up in Rwanda, and I've been there 2 years. And I've been working at the Isangi One Stop Centers, as you had mentioned earlier, which is the closest version of a family justice center, I think, anywhere in Africa. And Rwanda serves as the poster child, if you will, for other African countries. So we have presidents and dignitaries from all the other African countries coming to visit the Isangi One Stop Center in Rwanda.
And what does the center do? Tell us about the center.
The center provides co-located services. They have legal services, medical. It's actually established in a hospital. So they have medical services. They have a team of psychologists. They have social workers. And the goal of the president is to have 33 established Isangi one-stop centers throughout Rwanda. At this point, there are 17. So this model will be established all over the country.
That's great. Well, thank you for being with us today. I'll turn over the controls to you there, and you can dive into sharing, and
Okay.
I may ask questions along the way, but thank you for being with us. Thank you for being in our offices in San Diego and for recording this today with us.
Thank you. It's good to be back in San Diego. Okay, so today I'd like to kind of give a brief overview about what we're going to be covering. I'd like to cover both deaf culture and also to talk a little bit about people with disabilities in general. And I'm separating the two because many people that are deaf see themselves as a deaf culture rather than having a disability. So I am separating those. The needs of deaf people focus on language. The needs for people with disabilities in general don't necessarily focus on language. So accessibility to services via language is very important. So today we're going to talk about having deaf and hard of hearing clients at your Family Justice Center. What are some communication tips? What is American Sign Language and why is it so important? How do you use an interpreter? The prevalence of sexual abuse for deaf children, and the rate of domestic violence and intimate partner violence for deaf women or women with disabilities, and how do you screen for abuse in persons with disabilities? And then there are two slides, one power and control wheel for deaf women that's specifically applicable to that population, and then another power and control wheel for women with disabilities that's applicable to that population. So some demographics. There are about 38 million Americans who are deaf and hard of hearing. Approximately 2 to 3 out of every 1,000 children in the US are born deaf or hard of hearing. And the majority of those have a genetic component to it. Um, the statistics are variable, but it's estimated between 500,000 and 2 million people use American Sign Language, and it's the fourth most used minority language in the United States.
Mm.
There's what we call the 90% rule, um, that 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. 90% of deaf parents have hearing children, and 90% of hearing parents don't sign. 90% of parents and children report severe communication problems in the home. And this is an important statistic because uh, of the rate of child abuse that happens to deaf and disabled children. And also, when you receive deaf adults in your family justice center, assume that there's probably been a background of abuse, in part because there's been a tremendous lack of communication in the home.
Mm.
So, labels. What do we call deaf people? Is a label acceptable or is it insulting? Deaf people prefer to be referred to as deaf or hard of hearing. Hearing impaired, hearing challenged, hearing disabled, deaf, dumb, deaf, mute are felt as being very insulting. So when you have deaf people coming into the Family Justice Center or your agency, deaf or hard of hearing is very acceptable. The deaf community has many different subgroups within the community. Um, there are deaf people, there are hard of hearing people, there are codas, and codas are children of deaf adults. A SOTA is a sibling, um, and they have a deaf sibling. And then there are the interpreters that are also in the community. And any healthcare providers who work specifically with the deaf community are also included in that population. Um, some interesting little factoids about deaf culture. One of the things, if you begin working with the deaf community, people will, if you're hearing, people will ask you, why did you learn ASL? So everybody who comes into the community has a story. For me, my story was many years ago. I was referred a little deaf girl into my private practice, and she was referred by a social worker from Children's Hospital. Um, and she did tell me that this child is deaf, and it didn't register with me. And so I saw the little girl, and I said, "That's great, fine, thanks for the referral." And I saw the little girl with her mom, and her mom couldn't communicate with her either, because she didn't sign. But so I said to the mother, "Okay, thanks, for the background. Let me work alone with your daughter." And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, how am I going to communicate with this child? I don't know sign language. She doesn't talk. So how are we going to communicate? I remembered, use nonverbal techniques. So we did play therapy, art therapy. After about 5 times of seeing this child, I used the anatomically correct dolls. She demonstrated that she was being sexually abused by her father every night. He, in fact, admitted to this, and but at that point, I felt tremendously guilty. I felt, uh, how could I, as a professional who is supposed to be helping children, allow this child to be going back into the family while she's seeing me and continue to be abused by her father sexually? So at that point, I decided I'm going to go learn American Sign Language. This is never happening on my watch again. I could have said, "Oh, I'll never see another deaf person," or "I'll refer them." But instead, I chose to go and learn sign language. After that, I have pretty much committed my life to working with deaf people,
Mm.
both here in San Diego and now in Rwanda and other countries, Malawi also. Um, Language, ASL is the most often preferred method of communication for deaf people, although Some deaf people prefer to use signed English, and I won't go into that here, but it's important to ask deaf people what form of communication they're most comfortable with. Values in deaf culture, it's important to know that whereas hearing people think hearing is important, deaf people don't tend to think hearing is so important. So to ask a deaf person, well, how much do you hear? Can be insulted, and they don't really want to share how much they hear, what they don't hear, because it's not a value to them. It's not that important. ASL is very cherished and respected, and it's a primary identifying feature of deaf culture. So, in order to be considered a part of deaf culture, for a deaf person, they need to know American Sign Language. The hands are extremely important. I would almost say sacred, in the sense that they are the way of engaging with the world. They are the link to interacting with other people in the world. And when you're assessing domestic violence or IPV, this is an important fact to pay attention to. For someone to damage a deaf person's hands, it's it's I think it's almost like a felony. It's a way to limit their access to the world. So this is it's an important feature of assessment. Um, from a cultural perspective, speaking is really not a big deal. It's not considered something that's valuable or important. Deaf people growing up often have speech therapy ad nauseum, and they're told, "Oh, you know, you're doing so well, you're doing so well," and then they go out into the real world and people can't understand them, and they feel that they've been tricked, or it's a very humiliating experience for them. So.
Now, talk a little bit about reading lips.
Oh, I'll get into that,
Okay.
Casey. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
No. Lip reading is an interesting topic. We'll talk about it. There's a very strong emphasis on social and family ties within the deaf community. And if you have a deaf event, and I'm thinking of the one at the Family Justice Center when we had all the deaf women here, they stay. After an event is finished, it takes a long time for everyone to leave because you're still chatting, you're catching up on the news. So that's plan on another hour. It's also very common for deaf parents to want a deaf child. And I know pediatricians in the medical establishment kind of shake their heads at this, but deaf parents want a child that's like them, and they will be signing with that child from day one. So stories and poetry, passing down cultural information via sign language through poetry and telling stories is another very strong deaf cultural value. Eye contact is expected in the deaf culture, and breaking eye contact too soon is considered rude. So if you're a hearing person and you're interacting with a deaf person, eye contact is crucial. When you make introductions, usually people will ask, what's your name? Where are you from? Do you know other deaf people? Trying to establish whether you're a part of the deaf culture or not. Again, eye contact, very important. Lighting is also very important in order to be able to see signing. When you're interacting with deaf clients, you don't need to yell. That's not going to help them hear you. Don't mumble. If a person prefers to use speech reading, speak normally. Don't speak too slow and exaggerate your facial expressions and lip movements, because that's very difficult to understand. And men with facial hair, you're also very difficult to understand because your hair is covering your lips. So it's best face the person, make eye contact. And if you use written communication, although I think this is a tricky area, Make sure that the person understands. Many deaf people don't like writing back and forth because they're not comfortable with their ability to use written English. A lot of deaf English isn't the first language for many deaf people. Sign language, American Sign Language, is here in the U.S. So the English is not going to look like it's grammatically correct. Um, Pictures and other visual aids are helpful for communication. Most deaf people, I don't know, in my own personal experience, I think probably 99.9% of the deaf people I know have a phone. And so texting, instant message is a great way to communicate. Avoid background noise, be patient and relaxed when you're communicating, and ask questions. Ask the deaf person, what's the best way? What are you most comfortable with in terms of our communication? Um, Sometimes when you're asking questions to the deaf person, they might nod their head yes. It doesn't always mean yes. It can mean that they're stressed, they're not understanding you, or they're trying to please you and get this conversation finished.
Hmm.
Um, so they may understand that you're talking, but they don't understand what the concept is or what you're really saying. So be sure to make sure communication is clear. And eye contact, again, very important. Um, if you have a hard of hearing person, it can be really helpful to move the person to an isolated area, um, and make sure that you have time for communication. Don't try and get through this conversation really quickly. So when you're interacting with deaf and hard of hearing people, take the time to be patient and slow everything down so that you really have a good conversation with them. Um, Reducing stress, it's always helpful, especially in an emergency situation or a highly stressful situation, such as coming into a family justice center, um, to explain what actions you're going to take, what you need from the deaf person, why you need certain information. This will help calm the situation down and reduce stress. If you have a deaf person that's signing rapidly or using large signs, fast signs, this can indicate that they're under a lot of stress or their emotional levels are high. Um, and if you don't realize this, it could look like this deaf person is very aggressive and getting out of control because their signs are very big. To get a deaf or hard of hearing person's attention, make sure that they can see you. Make eye contact with them or gently kind of tap them on the shoulder. Or if you're entering a room and you want their attention, you can flick the lights, on, off. Um, or ask the person, what's the best way to get your attention? More tips on communication. A lot of these are just common sense. Don't yell at the deaf person from another room. If you have food or gum in your mouth when you're talking, it's going to make lip reading extremely difficult. One of the things that deaf people really don't like to hear, and is when you say, "Oh, never mind. I'll tell you later what we were talking about." This is something that deaf people they're told this from the time they're a child until they're an adult, and they feel rejected. They feel that they're not important enough to include in the conversation. When a deaf person asks you to repeat, don't roll your eyes, don't be upset with
Hmm.
them, um, don't exaggerate your responses. Many people say, oh, so I just need to learn sign language and I can communicate with any deaf person anywhere. No, you can't. There are hundreds of signed languages and dialects all over the world. Um, and so I'm living in Rwanda and I've learned Rwandan Sign Language. I've been working somewhat in Malawi, so I've been learning Malawian Sign Language.
Those are all different.
And they're all different, yeah. Um, although American Sign Language has somewhat colonized African Signed Languages because of Andrew Foster, who was the first African American deaf graduate from Gallaudet with a PhD. And I think it was a great gesture. He went to Africa to set up deaf schools, but he brought with him American Sign Language. So the indigenous signed languages didn't have an opportunity to grow on their own. So some countries are very influenced by American Sign Language. Sign language are not derived from or dependent on spoken language. They have their own grammatical structure and they're complete languages. Here in San Diego, American Sign Language and Mexican Sign Language are the two most commonly used. Facial expressions show grammar. And sometimes people think someone's upset or angry, but they're expressing emotion through grammar on the face. Lip reading, you'd asked about this earlier. Lip reading is extremely difficult. So if you want to try lip reading, watch TV, turn off the sound, and see how much you get. That's the best way I can suggest to anybody who's hearing.
Seems almost impossible to me.
It's pretty much impossible. Yeah, and even the most highly trained person under the best of circumstances gets about 33% of the conversation. So you can't depend on lip reading. Writing as a way to communicate with deaf people is kind of an interesting topic. In legal, medical, and mental health situations, expecting a deaf person to to communicate via writing, it's not appropriate and can actually violate their rights. Most deaf people graduate with between a second and fourth grade reading level. English is not their primary language. Hearing people have this kind of assumption that literacy and intelligence are positively correlated, and they're not. So you can be very intelligent and have poor English writing skills. Deaf people are very aware of hearing people's stereotypes and about their English ability. And so often they don't want to communicate by writing with hearing people. And this may include actually filling out paperwork and intake forms. So that's something to be sensitive to at the Family Justice Center. Using an interpreter. When you're working with a deaf person and an interpreter, look at the deaf person. Don't look at the interpreter. Address the deaf person directly as if the interpreter weren't even there. So, for example, when were you born? Instead of saying to the interpreter, ask him when he was born. Interpreters really appreciate having notes or outlines or handouts or any information in advance that you may be working with the deaf person on. If you're going to turn down the lights for some reason, make sure there's enough lighting for the deaf person and the interpreter to see each other. And the interpreter may ask to be seated or positioned in the best viewing angle. Use your normal voice tone at your own normal pace. The interpreter will tell you if you need to slow down or pause. Sometimes when people are reading, they typically speak quickly. So be aware of the pace of your speech. And also, and this is really, really important, especially in situations such as the Family Justice Center, if you're using an interpreter with a deaf person and there's something you don't want the deaf person to know, then don't say it. Because everything that you say, the interpreter is going to interpret for the deaf person. It's also not okay to tell the interpreter to talk about the deaf person after the deaf person leaves. The interpreter's job is simply to be a conduit for the conversation. And if you're unsure of the appropriate way to proceed using an interpreter, ask. Ask the deaf person, ask the interpreter. They'll be happy to help you. So now I want to talk a little bit about, in general, women with disabilities rather than specifically deaf women. Women with disabilities are more likely to suffer domestic violence and sexual assault than women without disabilities. They're more vulnerable. In fact, back to my story about this little deaf girl that I first saw, and she's the one that led me into my life career. Her father, one of the things he said was he had numerous daughters. She was the only deaf child he had, and he said, I chose her because she couldn't tell anyone.
Mm.
Um, and that's not uncommon. Women report that the abuse lasts longer and is more intense than women without disabilities. And like all women, women with disabilities are usually abused by someone they know, partner or family member. But women with disabilities also face the risk of being abused by a caregiver or a healthcare provider because they're so dependent on those caregivers. So, types of abuse that are really specifically related to women with disabilities, and these are areas or things that you should be thinking about when you're assessing a woman with disabilities at the Family Justice Center. Caregivers can withhold medicine um, or assistive devices such as wheelchairs or braces. They can also refuse to give the woman a bath or to help her with toileting or eating. Um, the physical abuse can be physically restraining the person, or suppose you're moving her from the wheelchair to the bed, you can be very rough doing that, drop her or physically injure her in some way. um, Sexual abuse can be not just sexual activities, but humiliating her by leaving her naked or exposed somehow. If she can't cover herself, you just leave her there. Um, Emotional abuse can take the form of threats of abandoning her. So, for example, saying, I'm leaving for the day, you're on your own. And she's stuck in bed all day, can't get up for the toilet, can't get food. Um, Financial abuse includes a personal assistant or provider who is supposed to work, say, from 7 to 6 at night, but doesn't show up until noon. Um, or they steal money or personal items or misuse debit or credit cards. Um, Abuse also includes intimidation, isolation, minimizing or justifying their treatment of the person with disabilities. Women with disabilities are at risk. The medication abuse, they may give you too much medication or not enough, or refuse to give you any medication, refusing to help bathe you, um, putting the walker just out of reach so that you can't possibly get to it, or taking the batteries out of your power driven wheelchair, or removing the phone, which is your lifelink. This is a power and control wheel that the Wisconsin Coalition Against Domestic Violence, excuse me, and the Wisconsin Council on Developmental Disabilities formulated this. So these are specifically for women with disabilities. Covers just what I was talking about. Um, and it's important when you're dealing with women with disabilities not just to think about traditional perpetrators such as husbands or boyfriends or family members, but to also think about and ask questions about caregivers and neighbors and friends who may be caring for the woman. So providers should routinely screen for unique forms of abuse, and it should be done when they're alone with the client. Um, Even if it's someone that you are thinking you're going to have a very difficult time communicating with, be prepared to be able to talk to this woman alone without her caregiver there, because
Mm.
that person may be the abuser. Sexual abuse is the most common form of abuse endured by children with disabilities. And deaf and hard of hearing children are not likely to disclose unless specifically asked about a history of sexual or physical abuse. And I would say from my own private practice for many, many years, this is very true. And sometimes it's because of the lack of communication between parents and children or caregivers and deaf children that they haven't learned that certain sexual abuse is inappropriate. It's not okay. So sometimes deaf kids assume, well, if this happened to me, it happens to everyone, because they haven't heard differently. They haven't been taught differently. And then this table shows the estimated prevalence of sexual abuse in the deaf and hard of hearing community. So it's a contrast between hearing and deaf, and you'll see hearing boys 10%, girls 25%, but deaf it's much, much higher. So boys, 54% of deaf boys have experienced sexual abuse, and girls it's 50 to 83%. So when you get a deaf client coming into your family justice center, just make the assumption that there's some sort of sexual or physical abuse in their background. I'm going to call this a recent study, but it's 2010 at Rochester Institute of Technology, did a study on comparing maltreatment, physical and sexual abuse among deaf and hard of hearing children and among hearing youth. And they found that there's a direct correlation between childhood maltreatment and higher rates of negative cognition, depression, and post-traumatic stress in adulthood. And I think you found that in the book that you wrote recently. Yeah. Respondents with more severe hearing loss indicated an increased rate and severity of maltreatment, which is a very interesting statistic. So the more hearing loss you have, the more likely your severity of abuse is going to be higher. And this was an interesting fact that having a deaf parent or family member who signs or being part of the deaf community did not necessarily reduce the risk of childhood abuse. Deaf and hard of hearing respondents who suffered abuse had higher rates of negative feelings about themselves and others in the future compared with hearing individuals who had also been abused. So this is very important in terms of the need in the community for therapists to be fluent in signing, because these kids need to be in psychotherapy. They need to know, that they're really okay.
Can I ask you a little bit about kind of the etiology of this?
Yes.
In Cheering for the Children, I talked a lot about this relationship between childhood trauma and then adult perpetration of violence and abuse. It's just usually hard to find adults who are violent and abusive who didn't experience some level of neglect, abandonment, and violence and abuse as children. It happens, but it's pretty rare, it appears to me, in most of the research. When you're talking about this in deaf children, is that the same pattern that you see, that the abuser is, whether a parent or not a parent, is probably themselves a trauma survivor?
I'll give you anecdotal, because I don't know that we've done studies specifically on that, but I ran a deaf domestic violence perpetrator group for men for 8 years in San Diego. And so I saw hundreds of men. And of those hundreds of deaf men, I would say 95% of them had experienced both sexual and physical abuse growing up. So I would say yes. Women that experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse growing up, I think it's the same as in the hearing community. We're not perpetrators necessarily of sexual abuse, but perhaps of physical abuse.
Well, and probably, as is true in ACE, more likely to become a victim as an adult, having been victimized as a child.
Yes. More incidents of rape, and also more psychosomatic illnesses, and depression, anxiety, PTSD. Again, some more statistics. Deaf children are 5 times more likely to be abused than hearing children. That's in the UK. Deaf children are 3 times more likely to be abused in the US. Deaf prisoners are abused at 3 times the rate of hearing prisoners. 1 in 4 deaf women are victims of domestic violence. 1 in 3 are victims of sexual assault. This is Deaf Hope is an organization in California that works with deaf and hard of hearing victims of domestic violence. And this is a power and control wheel that they use, which I think is excellent. It's visual, which is very appealing, to deaf people, and talks about specifically things that relate to deaf culture. So, for example, emotional abuse, criticizing the man criticizes your speech, your signing, or your English skills, or says, "Oh, well, you're hearing because you aren't fluent in ASL, or you don't socialize with the deaf community." They put down your educational background, um, tell you, you're like a hearing person. Isolation, looks at your phone for messages. I don't think anybody has a TTY now, but video phones. So maybe comes into the room when you're talking to someone on the video phone and like is eavesdropping on your conversation. Um, Isolates you from the deaf community or your family. Tells you nobody's going to believe you because he's well known in the deaf community and everybody believes him. Um, Intimidation, uses American Sign Language to make you afraid, gets in your face, signing when he's angry, gets angry at you because you look away while he's talking. Remember, I said earlier that eye contact is important, and if you look away, it's construed as rude. So, anytime you're looking away, he can get angry because he feels ignored by you. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, can throw things at you as a way to get attention, which is extremely rude to do that to a deaf person. Tells other deaf people private things in a public setting. So if you're out with your deaf friends, he can say, "Oh, my wife is lousy in bed." So he humiliates you in front of other deaf people. Um, Using the children. Suppose the partner is hearing, the perpetrator is hearing, and he doesn't allow your children to use sign language to talk to you. So this is isolating, cutting you off from communicating or interacting with your children. Um, Criticizes you as a deaf mother, says bad things about you, tells you and the children that you can't go to a shelter because everyone's hearing, so they won't understand you. So you can't find help anyway. So, you're stuck. You have to stay with me. Um, Uses hearing privileges, so excludes you from important conversations. Maybe he's talking to the bank, or maybe is talking to his girlfriend, but you have no idea who he's talking to because you can't hear the conversation. Leaves you out of social situations when he's interacting with other hearing people. He talks negatively about the deaf community. If you call the police to report abuse, he interprets to manipulate the situation to his benefit. And this is something that police officers need to really be aware of. And I think here in San Diego, Deaf Community Services has done many, many trainings with San Diego PD and talked to them about these particular situations, that it's important to have an interpreter in emergency calls when it involves domestic violence and a deaf hearing couple. Economic abuse, taking away Social Security checks or disability checks, ruins your ruins your chances for a job by spreading rumors about you, because the deaf community is very, very small and everybody knows everybody. Demands that you ask for permission before spending money. Destroying your reputation within the community by spreading false rumors, using his power in the community to pressure you to stay. Again, position as a leader in the deaf community. And these are positions of leadership and prestige, or people know each other within the community. So if a well-known deaf couple is having trouble in the community, most people know. Where to refer deaf abused women. The Alameda Family Justice Center has links on their website, actually, and I took these on the PowerPoint from their website, but these are all deaf organizations for victims of domestic violence.
Can I just make a comment about that? You know, early on, as you know, in the San Diego Family Justice Center journey, by having deaf community services there and having those services on site, we saw more deaf victims than we'd ever seen coming into the city attorney's office, into the DA's office, coming in for civil legal services, and having those services co-located on site, not just having a referral or an interpreter on call when we needed them, but actually having staff there made all the difference in the world. The Alameda County Family Justice Center has maintained that. The San Diego Family Justice Center has not. I'm sorry to say that comprehensive kind of on-site service is no longer at the San Diego Family Justice Center. And Deaf Hope moved their organization into the Alameda County Family Justice Center, which I loved, you know, that they gave them office space. They set them up there. Nancy O'Malley, of course, who's the DA, was very passionate about this. And I do think that that is what family justice centers need to be doing. I don't think it's just, you know, get an off-site partner or have a referral. Because I think it's fair to say in the early years of the San Diego Family Justice Center that when all we were doing was referring, deaf victims weren't coming to the Family Justice Center.
No, because you didn't have anything for
them. Didn't have
them.
any way to communicate with them.
Exactly.
We didn't have anybody that could talk to them. And if you show up and we have to say, hey, you know, we'll call somebody or we'll try to find somebody, they'd walk out the door.
Right. And I think, yeah, the Family Justice Center in San Diego went from seeing 0 deaf clients to having 87 the first year that we had services, direct services in American Sign Language for deaf people. So, yeah, it's, you know, that old saying, if you build it, they will come. So these are more, so suggestions that I would have for family justice centers. On your website, include deaf and disability related links. When deaf people go to the website or they're looking for help, if they see that you even put deaf or disability, they're going to feel, okay, this is a place that at least they know what to do with me here. You should know how to contact and use your local interpreting agency. You should know this before you need to use them. You should put interpreting costs into your annual budget because you will need to pay interpreters if you have deaf people coming and you don't have like a deaf community services or a deaf hope within your family justice center. Don't expect deaf people to provide their own interpreters and don't ask them to use family members to interpret them. And please don't ask children to interpret for deaf parents. Encourage the intake person at your family justice center to learn basic sign language. That shows deaf women that you care and you want them to feel welcome. And this was something that we did at the San Diego Family Justice Center. We actually had sign language classes and taught the staff sign language. And they were quite enthused about that. I mean, it was fun. So that's something else that's important to do. The more that you know about deaf culture and about domestic violence and how it shows up in deaf culture, the more likely deaf women are going to want to receive help from your family justice center rather than just stay in the violent situation because they feel no one can communicate with them, no one cares, and no one understands. Don't wait until the first deaf person shows up because if you wait, they're probably never going to show up. Find your local deaf community center and build a relationship. Invite them into the Family Justice Center. And if there are any deaf or fluent signing therapists near you, encourage them to join your Family Justice Center family. This, I liked this as an example, welcoming diversity. Safe Stop Abuse for Everyone in Austin, Texas has this on their website. We serve everyone, and then they list who they serve. Children, the deaf community, people with disabilities, families, LGBTQIA community, men and teens. So I think that's very welcoming. And that, I think, is the end.
Yeah,
And thank you.
that's great, Cindy, and I appreciate you sharing with us. A number of questions and comments have come in. Maybe I'll let me ask you one. Um, there's a person that wrote, I have worked with a deaf woman who was using an interpreter on Skype. We were on the phone for quite some time doing safety planning. What I did not know was that her husband was sitting next to her reading the same information about him.
Mm.
The interpreter was unable to tell me that he was there. Is there something that I could ask to make sure that she is in a safe place to speak to me?
Wow. I think that's something that everyone should be aware that anytime you're Skyping or anytime you're using video, um, that the possibility and the potential for the abuser to be watching the conversation is always there.
Hmm.
Um,
It's an interesting question. It's very similar in my mind. I mean, obviously, it's a little different when you're dealing with an interpreter and you're on Skype or on FaceTime or something like that. But it seems to me that um, the preparation for that should be kind of somehow preparing questions that let somebody say whether they're safe or not. That
mhm.
let somebody say, in the hearing community, I know that we used to do things like if you are completely safe right now, give me a number between 1 and 5. And it was very common that a person would say 6.
Ah,
And that was, I don't know what the equivalent of that would be in the deaf community, but that was a very significant one. And there would even be times when I was a prosecutor, when victims would want me to say certain things to them over the telephone because their husband was listening, and they would kind of contact an advocate and say, hey, I'm going to call and he's probably going to be listening, and I want you to know that, but I want you to tell him I have no control over this. You're prosecuting him whether I want you to or not, and you made the
exactly.
decision and not me.
Exactly.
And sometimes victims would say, and I actually want you to be really firm with me on the phone, like say you have no control over this, he has to answer for his, like be mean to me almost. And then we would set up the call, and knowing that he's probably
He's
watching or
listening.
listening in.
Hmm.
Now, I don't
Hmm.
know what the version of that would be in the deaf community, but it obviously for us, I think what changed for us was we didn't have to do that Skype piece because we actually got them in for services, I
Right.
guess. I mean,
Right.
it became, I think early on, I know when I was first a prosecutor, we had people that did sign language, and so we tried to do some things where they would go meet them somewhere, but that wasn't often safe for them to go to the house or even to go meet her at a coffee shop or something because he may follow or be there. And finally, when the Family Justice Center came along, we could actually say, we'll come get you and we'll pick you up. And then we knew that she was in a safe place once we got her to the Family Justice Center.
Right.
But then the safety planning was still complex because in many cases she was going home to him after she was at the Family Justice Center.
Yeah, and I think that happens a lot with deaf women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because going to a shelter is extremely difficult because there aren't uh, sign language interpreters available to them because of cost. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's very difficult for deaf women to go to a shelter.
Mm-hmm.
But back to the caller's question, I think if it's an initial call, if it's the first call, I think it's important at the very beginning of the conversation to talk about safety. Um, as you said, to ask the woman
Who's there with you, I guess, is
who's
an
with
early
you.
question, right?
Right? Are you alone? Are you okay? So kind of setting that stage. If this is maybe the second or third time that she's called, early on, I think it's important to develop a system of saying something as a code word that means this isn't a safe time, or if she notices that he just came into the room, um, I'll meet you for lunch later, or some change the subject, make it casual.
Hmm.
But I think it's up to uh, the person to set the stage early, to set the ground rules for safety, because that's
Hmm.
that's really important.
We've had a number of comments about this, and I do want to just mention it for those of you on the call that are professionals. Early on in my career, I made that mistake. I had a deaf woman on a case that I was prosecuting. She came with a sign language advocate that was there with her, who was signing with her. And I made that very mistake of talking to the interpreter instead of talking to her. And she was a very kind of firm, thoughtful woman, and I just loved it. She literally took my chin while I was talking to the interpreter and moved my face to face her, like saying, "I'm here.
Talk to me.
Talk to me. Look at me.
Yeah.
Respect me." I mean, she didn't do it in any kind of aggressive way. It was just like I was talking. All of a sudden, I just felt my head being moved, and
but you got the message.
She was saying, "Talk to me."
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I don't even remember if she was trying to speech read or lip read. I don't remember that. I just remember her look in her eyes, and she didn't really have to say anything or communicate any other way. I knew that she was saying, "You're disrespecting me and you're ignoring me as a person."
And that's an excellent point, Casey, because so often deaf people feel excluded. And if I'm the victim and I'm coming to you for help, don't look at the interpreter. I'm the victim. You know, I should be the most important person in the room in terms of you wanting to help me. So, yeah, I bless her heart for doing that. She got her message across.
Well, and I do want to emphasize what you said, Cindy, about this whole notion of not waiting until you have a deaf or hard of hearing survivor walking into your family justice center. You've got to build that capacity. You should be building that capacity before you even open. But for sure, as soon as you realize that you don't have those services for victims, I mean, I don't think in some ways it's very unique. In other ways, it's a consistent principle for us that if you don't have people that can communicate with, that look like, that talk like, that are like the people you want to serve, they're not coming to you.
Exactly.
Until we had gay and lesbian identified staff early in the Family Justice Center, we didn't have the LGBTQ community coming to us. And once we had gay and lesbian identified staff there, they knew it was a safe place to come. And they knew that when they got there, they were going to have people that were like them, that could communicate with them, and that connected to their community. And I don't think it's different, but it's a similar dynamic, that if you don't have people that are part of the deaf community involved in your Family Justice Center, they're not coming to you.
Right. And I think one of the mistakes that family justice centers make are saying, "Oh, well, you know, we don't ever see deaf people.
Yeah, we don't have that need.
They must not, you know, be out there." But they are. And in fact, you know, what we just talked about is their rate of abuse is much higher than hearing people. So they are out there in double the numbers.
Yeah, very, very, I think that's just an excellent point. And I think that's a point that we just need to keep emphasizing. And one of the things that was so moving to me was, as in those early years of the San Diego Family Justice Center, when you kind of shared with us some of the experiences of people in the deaf community and how they had such a difficult time going to the courthouse, going to a restraining order clinic, trying to show up at the prosecutor's office. And for me, that's just all the more reason to argue for a collaborative service model like a Family Justice Center. Because if you've got 15 agencies in your community, it's easier to have them all under one roof, where a deaf survivor can come one place and have access to all those 15 agencies, than for that deaf survivor to have to go to 15 different places and have to have all of those 15 places have the ability to sign and communicate with that victim. It's just so logical to say this is going to make a lot more sense if you have one place and you have one entity or one service program that can help communicate. And I think Gail was telling me this a while ago when we were talking about it. She reminded me that early in those years, sometimes your advocates would literally walk from agency to agency with the survivor, and they became the gateway. It wasn't our navigators didn't all sign, and they needed somebody.
Right.
And suddenly these 15 services were all available to a survivor instead of just your agency. And I can't remember where Deaf Hope was before they moved into the Alameda County Family Justice Center. But I remember when the decision was made that, you know, they were going to move their program into the center. And there was controversy about it. It was like, you're going to be connected to the DA's office. You're going to be connected to law enforcement. And, you know, they may not want to come there. And it all had to do with how they designed it and their welcomeness and their
Yeah.
openness and their
Yeah.
ability to still run their own organization. The DA wasn't running Deaf Hope. The DA wasn't telling them what to do or how to operate. They were simply providing the space, which can save them money in the process too, so they don't have to go rent space somewhere else. So I don't know how many centers. We need to probably add that to our national survey. We do an annual survey of all family justice center directors, and I'm not sure if we have asked in the
Ah,
last couple of years about how services are provided to deaf or hard of hearing survivors. We need to start asking that question.
I think that's a
Maybe we
great
can
idea.
ask it this next year, because I don't know. I know that Language Line has done some work with some family justice centers with American Sign Language. I know about the Alameda County's co-location of Deaf Hope. I actually don't know how many centers have services for the deaf community on site, available. So I think that's a challenge, not just for centers, but for us as the Alliance, to really figure out how many are providing those services on site.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And also asking family justice centers, have you connected with your local deaf community center?
Hmm.
Because most communities have a deaf community center or an organization that serves the deaf community.
I was kind of stunned by the number at the beginning, 38
Million.
million.
Yes.
That is a combination of people who were born deaf,
Yes.
people who have lost their hearing. I would guess that of people who lose their hearing, a large percentage of those are seniors or older people
Older.
that have lost their hearing along the way.
Hmm.
I mean, I have a parent situation, a grandparent situation where we have someone who's hard of hearing and does not want to accept any hearing devices or
Uh-huh.
any assistance
Uh-huh.
of any kind, and he can hear very little. He misses
Yes.
so much.
Yes.
And if he were in a victimized situation and he were to come into the chaos of a financial fraud unit at a family justice
Oh
center
no.
or an elder abuse program, or the cacophony of what would be happening inside a kitchen or a living room or a children's room at a family justice center, he would he,
He couldn't hear
when there's
any of
more
it.
than 10 conversations going on in a room,
Right.
he can't hear anything.
Right.
I mean, everything is just a mess to him, and as a result, he just shuts down because he
Right.
can't hear what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's sad because I think people don't tend to take the time to really make sure that the hard of hearing person is understanding the conversation. Um, I've People have pointed out to me since I've been in Rwanda, and most people don't, necessarily speak English there, and they're constantly saying, slow down.
Mm,
And they're hearing people. So I'm very aware that making sure the person understands you, and you may need a room where there's just the two of you without that external noise, without that background noise going on. The lighting is good. I mean, there are many different things. And I think encouraging hard of hearing, especially older hard of hearing people, I'm patient. I really care about what you have to say to me. So often we just, it's like, hurry, hurry, hurry. I have other things to do. Just tell me what you need. Tell me what you want. And they're tired of
mm,
having to go through that extra effort
yeah.
to make themselves heard and understood and to communicate. The rate of depression in older adults with hearing loss is very high, very
They're
high.
isolated.
They're very isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm,
So taking the time and being patient is, I think, one of the most important things
mm.
that people can do to let the other person know you care about them.
Well, Dr. Cindy Cassady, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for sharing with us. I do think you have put out a challenge to not just Family Justice Center folks, but to anybody working in a community based organization or a government organization that's trying to provide services to people who have experienced violence and abuse. What are you doing to serve the deaf and hard of hearing community? And have you really taken the opportunity to sit down and listen to what their challenges are in your community? I am convinced that if we sit down and actually take the time to let the deaf and hard of hearing community communicate with us about all of their challenges, we would do our jobs very differently.
Yes.
And I'm also convinced that an enormous number of perpetrators and abusers get away with their conduct over and over and over again because we're doing such a poor job of not only providing services, but being able to simply figure out what's going on to the point that someone that's violent and abusive can be held accountable, can be prosecuted, that the violence can stop, because violence and abuse doesn't stop by itself, and people don't wake up one day and think, I'm not going to abuse anymore. I think today's a new day. I'll never do that again. Well, they do say that, but of course it
doesn't work.
becomes true without intervention. So if you've been listening today and there's others in your organization or in your Family Justice Center community that need to hear this, I encourage you to stay tuned. We will be sending out information from this webinar, including a link to this recording. And as I mentioned, in 2 days, we will be doing a second recording. It won't be broadcast live, but it will also be available to you on our resource library at familyjusticecenter.org. We will send out that link to everybody who has been registered for this webinar as well, so that you will have access to both of those. This is kind of a basic 101 course on these issues. And then on Thursday, we'll go a little deeper, talking about really helping victims of complex trauma. We'll talk about strangulation survivors and the complexity of those cases. So I want to thank Dr. Cindy Cassady. I want to thank Amber, our interpreter today, who has been signing for those that are on this webinar, that were able to benefit from the use of American Sign Language for communication today. And I want to thank you all for being with us. As we wrap up the webinar, just a few shout outs, one on our conference. And if you're interested in our conference, I hope you will go to familyjusticecenter.org or .com and begin to pursue that. I strongly encourage you, don't come to this conference by yourself. We like teams to come to these conferences. We love to see communities, small, medium, or large, bring police officers, prosecutors, advocates, doctors, nurses, therapists, civil legal service providers, and others together. And it'd be great for you to bring members of the deaf community with you. If you have a service agency or a program that's helping the deaf and hard of hearing community, we'd love to have them learn more about the Family Justice Center world. This is a great way to help them see the vision for bringing services under one roof for victims and communities. And I will say, as we're wrapping this up with Cindy, I think it's probably fair to say that if it would be the same thing with the deaf and hard of hearing community. If you were to say, would you like to go 20 places, or would you like to go one to get help?
One.
The answer is always going to be one.
Yes.
And that is the vision of Alliance for Hope International. We're the only national organization advocating for that one place approach. We mentioned our books, and we do talk a little bit about services for deaf and hard of hearing communities that we've seen around the country in family justice centers. I mentioned the trauma piece, and we'll talk a little bit more about that trauma piece and the connection between childhood trauma and adult trauma in the next webinar that we will record on Thursday. We mentioned, that's the wrong slide. Our next course is actually February 14 to 17 in San Diego. And we would love to have you join us for that. You can join our mailing list at Hope Giver. Just text it, the word Hope Giver to 22828. We mentioned our social media presence. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. On behalf of our CEO, Gail Strack, and our entire team at Alliance for Hope International, we're very honored to have Dr. Cindy Cassady with us today and sharing this kind of challenge to us. We hope that you will all have a blessed holiday season and that you will take some time to be with friends and family. We've been reminded in my family of the incredible fragility of life with a recent diagnosis of one of my children battling cancer. And I just want to tell you, go hug your kids, go hug your family members, go hug friends, and spend time during the holidays here, not just helping others in need, but I hope taking care of yourself and spending time refreshing yourself. We're honored to have you with us on this call today, and we wish you a blessed holiday season and a happy 2017. Thanks for being with us.